What if I told you that you have no justification whatsoever for any of your moral beliefs? That every time you speak up and speak out to condemn a political leader or an act of atrocity, you're really just voicing unjustified opinions. The Diary of a CEO host, Steven Bartlett, recently had Christian Wes Huff on his podcast. And in the discussion, at one point, they dip into the topic of morality. And in the process, I think the number one thing that got missed in that interview emerges, and it's something that has massive implications for your moral beliefs. In this video, I'm going to try to untangle their conversation about morality and point out what I think they got wrong and why it matters so much. But before I get started, I want to say up front that I have tremendous respect for both Steven and Wes, and this video is certainly not going to be a critique of either of them. Rather, I want to sort of join in on the conversation and provide some helpful insights that I think got missed during the rapid live flow of a conversation between two very intelligent and articulate men. So let's begin with this brief clip from Steven that sort of sets things up.
I think for me, that was one of the persuasive arguments of the new atheist movement that I became a part of when I was 18 years old, which was, I think Richard Dawkins had said about, if God is all loving, then why would he let a 2-year-old kid in Africa have their eyeball eaten out from the inside by a parasite?
So Steven provides a rhetorical and psychologically powerful example of the problem of evil and suffering, which he says played a key role in his coming into the new atheist movement for a while when he was younger. And basically what the problem of evil and suffering is something like this, that you look around and you see what appear to be really awful instances of suffering that are gratuitous, that have no moral justification. And if there's an all-good, all-knowing God who's ruling the universe, that shouldn't be the case. If God is all good and all-powerful, then why would we see the kind and the amount of suffering that we see, where even an innocent child has, in the case that they end up talking about, their eye being eaten out from the inside?
Now, part of the problem with it is that if we're talking about evil with a capital E, we're implying that there's a good with a capital G. And so I think we do run into an issue when saying that evil exists, we're implying that good exists. And if we're implying that good exists, we're implying that there's a moral law to adhere to call the good good and the evil evil. And if there's a moral law, then there has to be a moral lawgiver.
So right before that clip I just played, Wes acknowledges that Steven's question is a really good question, a really hard question. But then he goes on to point out the fact that the atheist may have an even bigger problem on his hands, namely the inability to justify his belief that there is something truly evil or immoral or wrong about this child's suffering. So here we have this child who is going through this terrible suffering. And the question is, as an atheist, am I able to say anything more than just, ew, I find that personally, subjectively distasteful. I find that saddening and unpleasant. What Wes is pointing to here is something called the grounding problem. Essentially, it asks the question, if there are moral facts in the universe, what makes those facts true? Where do they come from? What is it that makes a moral fact, like that it's wrong for a child to suffer, true? So let's see how Steven responds.
I think the atheist movement would argue that moral good is virtue of what helps me to survive. So watching a small child suffer in such a way, if I didn't feel anything bad about that, then I wouldn't have the wiring for survival, because I wouldn't have the proclivity to defend a suffering child. If I don't have that, then I probably don't reproduce and I don't pass on my genes, and then I'm selected out of existence. So that pain I feel when I see a child suffering is a function of my evolutionary mechanics that make me more likely to survive.
So Steven proposes a potential solution that an atheist could offer by pointing to our evolutionary history. And this is where things start to go off the rails a bit. Now, in both Steven and Wes's defense, this is probably the number one mistake that most people make when they start thinking about the nature of morality. So let's see what's going on. Wes has just pointed to a problem regarding the ontology of ethics, what it is that makes them true and how they exist. Because for Wes, as a Christian who believes in a necessarily existing all-good God, he has something to create a standard for good, namely the nature of that God. And once you have that in place, now you can define evil as a departure from that good. Or to put it another way, God serves as a sort of straight line against which we can measure any other line, whereby, therefore, we can call any other line crooked and actually mean something by it, because we're defining the way in which it departs from the straight line, which is God. But when Steven responds to this, he doesn't provide an alternative account from the atheist standpoint for the ontology of ethics. Instead, he unintentionally shifts the conversation from the ontology of ethics over to the epistemology of ethics. Now, we say epistemology, that is just the area of philosophical inquiry that deals with the nature of knowledge. It asks questions like, what can we know and how can we know it, and what is knowledge? And so this shifts the conversation to the source of our beliefs instead of to the nature of reality to which those beliefs are pointed. In other words, instead of answering a question about the ontology of ethics and how they exist, it shifts the conversation to explore explanations for why we form the moral beliefs that we have. And this becomes really evident in this next clip.
We could band together and take on the lion, or band together and take on the elephant, or whatever. And it's actually that, in part, there you have, like, I need to take care of you, you need to take care of me, and we're going to reciprocate that altruism and increase our survival chances. So, again, that might explain why I care about that kid. Because the species that didn't, they would never have been able to band together and take on the elephant.
Notice Steven says that our evolutionary history might explain why he cares about the kid. But Wes's question was not about figuring out why we happen to care about a child who's suffering, but rather a more universal and fundamental question, which is, should we care about the suffering child? In other words, is there something objectively, morally wrong about this child's suffering that causes it to be the case that we ought to therefore have concern and compassion on the child? And Steven doesn't answer that question in this discussion. And this is where things get really interesting, because in the process of offering up a potential solution, he actually points us to a much more serious problem. And that problem goes completely unaddressed in the discussion. In my assessment, it's the most serious problem challenging all of our moral beliefs. And it's hard to overstate how important that is. The moral beliefs that we hold are the most important values or most important beliefs that we have. The beliefs we have about justice and fairness and equality and rights, these are central to who we are and how we think about the world. And what Steven just said might unravel all of them completely. Now, I want to take a close look at this problem, and to do that, we have to wade into some philosophy. But I want to caution you against thinking of this as some kind of abstract formulation or argument. This is extraordinarily practical and existential. The view that Steven describes is that our evolutionary history plays a crucial role in the development of our moral beliefs or our moral psychology. And by evolutionary history, I mean roughly the socio-biological conditions and pressures that led to us becoming who we are by natural selection. So here's the question. What is the basis for natural selection in evolutionary theory? The answer, of course, is fitness for survival. But hang on. If natural selection is selecting for fitness for survival and not for truth, and that is what came to shape our moral intuitions that lead to our moral beliefs, then we got the set of moral intuitions that we have by a process that was not optimizing for truth, but for survival. And if that's the case, we have to ask ourselves what justification we have for thinking that our moral beliefs are actually true. And part of what makes this question so challenging is that it's not like we can go out and empirically verify our moral beliefs. It's not like they're some part of the physical world that we can go out and measure or weigh. So I think an analogy will help us really see the force of the argument. Imagine I have a calculator right here, and the calculator is designed to make the user feel optimistic about the future. The thing that the calculator was designed for, optimized around, was to make sure that anyone using it will feel optimistic about their future. And so as I type into the calculator how much money I'll have in 10 years, if I save $100 a week, it tells me the answer is $1 million. And that makes me feel really good about my future. But as soon as I learned that the calculator was optimized or designed to yield answers that make me optimistic about the future rather than mathematical truths, what would that do to the confidence I have in the answers the calculator gives me? Should I believe the answers from a calculator that was designed not to produce truth, but to produce some sort of positive feeling in me? What philosophers have argued persuasively for over the past couple of decades is that this is roughly the situation we find ourselves in with respect to our moral beliefs. Our moral beliefs were formed through a process that was optimized for survival, not for ethical truth. And once we realize that, we see that we no longer have justification for those beliefs that we hold, and any confidence that we had that they were actually true is gone. Now, I'll give another analogy that may make it even more obvious. So imagine you are out in this huge open field, and you've been tasked with identifying where metal is located underground in that field. And you're given a metal detector to do the job. So you work your way across the field, marking on the surface anywhere that it indicates that there's metal. When you get to the other side, you meet up with a team of other people who have been doing the same thing using the same brand metal detector. And so as you all compare notes, your confidence increases. The areas that you all located metal in are very similar. There's a lot of similarities and overlaps. Everyone is roughly in agreement. It seems like you all have really found where the metal is. And so as you all are basking in this confidence, though, along comes a man who asks to inspect the detectors. After inspecting them, he announces to the team that, unfortunately, these detectors aren't designed to detect metal. They're designed to ensure the safety of the user who is crossing a minefield. So as it turns out, the field that you all just crossed was full of explosive landmines. And the only reason you got to the other side is because you were using this device that helped fit you for survival. The bad news is that you now have zero confidence in all of the locations where you marked that you thought metal was. And so today, I'm kind of that man inspecting the metal detectors. Another way to see the force of this line of reasoning is something called the argument from symmetry, which goes something like this. We can imagine that there's another species that looks a lot like us, that is a lot like us, but that came to be with a slightly different evolutionary history. And the different characteristics of their evolutionary history has produced in them a different set of moral intuitions, leading to a different set of moral beliefs. Under those circumstances, it becomes really hard to explain why we should privilege our moral beliefs over this other group that has, through a different evolutionary history, come to a different set of conclusions. So imagine, for example, that we evolved to come to value things like parental care and cooperation and fairness. But this other species, who came to be under a slightly different set of evolutionary pressures, came to believe in things like dominance, infanticide, and ruthless competition. If both of these moral outlooks are the product of evolutionary history, then a sort of symmetry obtains between the two, and it becomes really arbitrary for us to say that we have justification for believing that our moral beliefs are true, while theirs are false. And it's worth noting that other social creatures have evolved to have very different sets of acceptable practices. Everything from cannibalism to forced procreation to oppression based on class, and even killing based on class. We can see these in the animal world in other creatures that have social dynamics. And so if our evolutionary history has played a critical role in the formation of our moral beliefs, it's not a stretch to think that if we could go back in time, rewind the tape, and adjust the conditions a bit, we might end up with very different beliefs about morality today. In fact, our moral intuitions may affirm things like cannibalism and infanticide rather than being repulsed by them. To put this back in the context of the discussion between Wes and Steven, Wes points out that the atheist is in a difficult position to explain ontologically where moral truths come from. And Wes, in his response, helps us see that even if we could figure out the ontological grounding for morality, we have a different problem, which is that we can't justify any of our moral beliefs because they were formed, or they were the result of a process that was optimizing for survival rather than tracking some mind-independent moral domain of good and evil. Now, if you think you have some kind of solution or way out of this argument, let me know in the comments below. I'd really like to read those. This is something I've spent a lot of time thinking about, and as I get comments from that, I may decide to make another video to respond to some of those and dive into more detail on this argument. Now, one thing that I've found missing sometimes from discussions about arguments like these is there's a disconnect, there's a lack of a connection between the philosophically serious idea and the gravity of its existential implications. That's something I really want to avoid, and so I want to turn now to why this matters. If this argument works as well as I think it does, what does that mean? We've already seen that it sucks the life out of our moral assessments. It cripples our ability to make real, meaningful moral judgments when we're faced with things that seem so obviously blameworthy, like, for example, what we're seeing in the Epstein files today. But it doesn't stop there. It reaches into the whole of our daily lives. As humans, we long for meaning. We long to have meaningful lives. And as people have struggled to find that today, it's led to what has been dubbed the crisis of meaning. And I think part of the problem is that if you want to build a life of meaning, it has to be built on or around a structure of values. because values have to serve as a sort of scaffolding system from which meaning can be erected in our lives. So if we find that any value system we come up with is essentially arbitrary, if we find that we have no justification for thinking that our value system, whatever it is actually true, is actually tracking some part of reality, when the justification for your value system collapses, along with that falls any hope we have of finding an objective meaning in life that can be pursued and obtained. Now, one thing you may be thinking is that the theist, someone like Wes Huff, is in a different position with respect to these arguments. And as it turns out, this is exactly what the philosopher Thomas Bogardus has pointed out. As devastating as these arguments are, they only work against the naturalist, against the person who is constrained in their explanations to the natural or quasi-physical world. But if God exists, it becomes really easy to posit that God could have imparted into us the ability to obtain moral knowledge. And in fact, if Christianity were true, this is probably exactly what you would expect, that the God who is moral and good would create us as creatures who can know something about that goodness. Now, the uncomfortable conclusion that this leads us to is that it may be that religious people are the only people who can justify their moral beliefs. Someone like Wes, as a Christian, believes in a God who is good with a capital G, who has created us not just as conscious creatures, but as creatures with a conscience, whereby we can know moral truths, which means we can discover a true value system that can then be used to build meaningful lives. So I guess what I'm saying is we should really hope that Wes is right. And perhaps more than just hoping, that it's something worth finding out, that we shouldn't just write this off, that this is something that we ought to explore. If it is the only hope we have of building objectively meaningful lives that are built around a value system that is not arbitrary, surely this is something we have to give attention to. And that's one of the things I'll definitely be doing on my channel and on my Substack. So if you're interested in that, I would encourage you to hit subscribe. And if you've enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. I may also interact with some other parts of this interview that I thought were really interesting. So again, if you want to catch those, make sure you hit subscribe. And let me know in the comments what you make of all this. Where do you stand? Do you think that you have objective moral beliefs that are actually true and have confidence in that? And if so, why? What is it about my argument that fails, especially if you don't have the theistic framework to work from? Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.